Greetings. My name is Aaron Stauffer, and I want to welcome you all to the most recent webinar of Religions for Peace USA, The Challenge of ISIS in America, where we will feature perspectives of interfaith leaders and peace builders. With me today are Dr. Omid Safi of Duke University and Dr. Jerusha Lamptey of Union Theological Seminary. I'm excited to have both of these wonderful panelists with us today, and I'm sure that our conversation will be fruitful, nuanced, and productive. What we're going to do is we're going to feature about 25 minutes of conversation between the two panelists. I'll ask them a number of questions and invite them to react to each other. And then we'll open it up to the general audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to tweet them to us, where our tweet or our Twitter is @RFPUSA, or Facebook them to us to facebook.com/religionsforpeaceusa. We also will welcome this at email too, but perhaps social media is the quickest way to do this. I'm excited for this conversation, and to really just provide a little bit of background about where this conversation takes place, we have to first understand where it's coming from. And that's the first question that I want to pose to Dr. Safi here, is to talk a little bit about where our conversation today is situated in regard to the general media's conversation. What's lacking in the media's conversation? And really, this question is really first posed to you to set us up and get us on a good starting place. And then perhaps if you could speak a little bit about your piece that was featured on NPR's On Being and some of the nuanced perspective that you presented there, I think that would be very helpful for all the viewership.
Well, thank you, Brother Aaron, Sister Jerusha. It's lovely to be with you. So let's just begin with taking count of where we are. We are now going on 11 years of an American war in Iraq. We are still entangled in Afghanistan, and just this week we have the British soldiers leaving Afghanistan. We have a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale happening in Syria, with at least 200,000 human beings being killed, the creation of the largest refugee crisis in the world. And then we have the ongoing, decades-long occupation in Palestine still happening. Part of the challenge that I think as people of faith we are faced with is, what do we have to say? Where do we stand? Do we have something to offer that is bigger, broader, more compassionate, more just, more anguished than simply the understandable message of we hate and condemn, we hate and condemn, we hate and condemn, which seems to these days be the sixth pillar of faith that is required of Muslims. And I'd like to think, as people who stand in a prophetic tradition of Jeremiah and Amos, Jesus and John the Baptist, and the Prophet Muhammad, that we have an urgent, compassionate cry, which is to stand up for all of us. What we're dealing with ISIS or ISIL or IS or Daesh or whatever the heck we want to call them this week is a group whose brutality is so real, so widespread, that at this point they're stretched from the borders of Iran to Iraq to Syria to the borders of Turkey, that they are really demonstrating the shortcomings of a world in which the American empire, and we should never be under any delusions about what the United States is today. We are an empire in decline. We are a militaristic empire that is stretched beyond the point of sustainability. That the United States is neither capable or willing or wise enough to handle the situation of being a unipolar leader, nor do we have a model of a global United Nations-led intervention to address the real challenge of human suffering. And as a result, we're left in this catastrophic situation of selective interventions, where interventions oftentimes look like bombardments from the air and then dropping weapons that sometimes end up in the wrong hands. We seem to act when we are moved by the images and the suffering of some communities, such as the Yazidis and the Christians in Iraq, but not of others. For example, the Syrians, who have been slaughtered on a far greater scale. And then one should never mince words or attempt to minimize the brutality of ISIS. I mean, let's get real here. This is a group that is so violent, so destructive, so misogynistic that Al-Qaeda has had to distance itself from them. And when Al-Qaeda is coming out and saying, you know, bro, you've gone too far, I think you have some sense of the violence and the savagery of this particular movement. And I don't think one should minimize it. I think where we find ourselves is who's going to speak up, who's going to stand up for those human beings, be they Muslim, Yazidi, Christian, Jewish, whatever their background happens to be, who somehow find themselves pinched between the brutality of ISIS on one hand and the brutality of the American empire on the other hand. What do the people of faith have to say about this context in which we don't have a sustainable response? And I think part of the real serious challenge, and this is what I had been alluding to in that piece, is as people of faith, what do we do in the name of, in the cause of violence that's committed by our co-religionists? And if we're watching certain components of the media, whether it's Bill Maher on HBO, or for that matter, the President of the United States in the United Nations General Assembly, where while acknowledging that the ideology of ISIS does not represent the teachings of Islam, the president does go on to say that it is time for the world, and in particular Muslim communities, and I quote, to explicitly, forcefully, and consistently reject the ideology of Al-Qaeda and ISIL. And part of what I tried to do in that particular piece on being was to actually reach back to the prophetic tradition of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and in this beautiful distinction that he makes, where he states, few are guilty, all are responsible. And I want to take that notion seriously. Few are guilty. Yes, ISIL is guilty. Those in charge of the Assad regime are guilty. Those in charge of the militia and the Israeli military and Hamas are guilty. The American empire's assault on human life is guilty. But then Heschel's rejoinder is not that Muslims are responsible, all are responsible. I am responsible, you're responsible, we are responsible, and we are each other's keepers. We are all accountable and responsible for each other. And at that level, what I want to push back against, what I want to reject and critique, is this notion that an African-American Muslim living in Atlanta, a Bangladeshi Muslim living in Brooklyn, has a particular moral responsibility to dismiss and distance itself from the atrocities of ISIS halfway around the world, because that, to me, is not perpetuating the prophetic notion that we're all responsible. It is actually tapping into a notion of collective guilt. It's this notion that some of us are responsible on the basis of our ethnicity or religion for the actions and atrocities that other people who might share our religion or our ethnicity are committing halfway around the world. And of course, we don't carry that critique out consistently. That burden is one that is selectively applied to beleaguered communities. So for my own part, I'm interested in shifting the framework of the discussion and talking about what is our collective responsibilities. What is it that as people of faith we all have to say, particularly with respect to the most marginalized members of humanity, particularly for the folks that Fanon and others would have called the non-persons of history. Can we mourn those who don't make the headlines? Can we mourn the peoples whose names, whose faces, whose narratives are never allowed to inform the stories? And I think we have a particular responsibility to begin with those that, echoing the 25th chapter of Matthew's, are called the least of God's children. And I think we have a responsibility to begin any kind of a moral conversation with the least of God's children. Who's standing up for them? Who is making their stories known? Who's amplifying their voices? And that's where I'd like to start, and then turn it over to Sister Jerusha to take it over.
Am I taking it over, or is Aaron posing a new question?
Thank you.
I guess I would like...
Yeah, please go ahead. I mean, one of the things that I do want to add in this is that I think what you've done, Omid, is to set us up with a broader context and allow us to see this conversation that it's not singularly informed. We're dealing with something that's deeply multifaceted. But there is a unique challenge, I think, for the interfaith community in the United States, for us to be able to understand and face the challenge adequately to build community and build understanding amongst various people of faith here. And the challenges inherent in that, I think, are unique, but not unrelated from history. So I'm thankful for what you've presented to us, and that you are being honest in the way in which we approach this conversation. There's oftentimes glosses in the media where it will show how ISIL or Daesh is very effective on galvanizing the sentiments of disillusion and disaffection. Well, where do those sentiments come from? And how do we connect that to a history of colonialism and imperialism and neocolonialism? But there are more practical challenges, as I mentioned, and I feel like I want to shift now to Jerusalem and ask that sort of question of what are the challenges of building understanding and building community across religious and cultural and ethnic divides here in the United States. Perhaps you can shine some light on that for us.
Yeah. Well, I love that you used the word community and drew attention to this as one of the stakes in the argument, because I'm not sure that this is how it is usually talked about. And I really do believe that it's our definition of community that is one of the pieces in this puzzle that is frequently not unveiled, if you will. How do we define community? Who is in our community? What community matters to us? What communities don't matter to us? What community makes us get up at arms? And which communities can we just, as Omid said, just not even pay attention to while they suffer? And I do think that at its core, that this is a question of how we define who is important to us, who is relevant to us, and who is connected to us. And so one of the things that I think we need to consider as an interfaith voice or community or voices or communities is how exactly we do define this notion of community. And if we do it in an oversimplified fashion, frequently, and this is not news to anyone who studies violence or oppression, identity is deployed in a very particular way in situations of violence and situations of lack or need or oppression, and it gets used as a very effective tool to galvanize people and galvanize them in a way that they would otherwise usually not behave. And so what I think we need to do is we need to probe identity a little bit more than we do normally. Now this sounds very theoretical and very academic, and how are we going to do this and talk publicly about it? But I think it's a question how we can talk about this in a way that makes sense in the public discourse. And one of the things is this. You see this very simplified us versus them rhetoric. You see this very simplified Muslims versus everybody else rhetoric. This is a representation of a simplified understanding of identity. and who and what connects us. All Muslims have to be somehow connected to ISIS. That's because Islam is the connective tissue, and then other people are somehow excluded. And this gets played out over and over again. I think that we as interfaith communities need to challenge this notion, and not just challenge it as in something holds them all together, but challenge it in the notion that it is an oversimplified depiction that ignores internal diversity, but also ignores what most of our traditions say, which is that there is a common good, that there's a moral responsibility, as Omid was saying, that transcends self-identity. And so I think it's only in probing those things and looking at how we construct those people who are similar to us and therefore valuable, and those people who are different from us and therefore not of any valuable, that we can actually begin to chart a new course in the public discourse. Because this public discourse and the notion of collective responsibility is just premised upon the notion that you can define clearly and definitively and simplistically who is us and with us and who is against us. And, you know, I just would add another level to this. So I think we need to probe that construction, but I also think we need to be very aware that it's not just a cognitive construction in play, that there's fear in play. And fear needs to be addressed as well. Maybe it's illegitimate fear, maybe it's fear premised off of faulty cognitive assumptions, fine, but fear is a very real emotion. Fear as well as suffering, and we need to develop ways to deal with them. Now, the good news is I think that this is what religious traditions do. They teach people about fear, and they teach people how to have hope in the face of fear. But one of the things we need to do is meet that where it is and inspire hope, but we also need to problematize oversimplified constructions of us and them, of collective responsibility, of exclusion from value, and we need to have a discourse, which this will be, I guess, my final point at this juncture. We need to be able to have the messy conversation, which is the conversation Omid's pointing to. We can't have the conversation of ISIS is horrible. Yes, ISIS is horrible, but that's not the whole conversation. The whole conversation is, why are they there? How did they get there? What responsibility do we bear? How can we be involved? How can we work together? There's all these pieces, but when you pull off the reductive veneer that we've placed over this conversation, there's a whole lot of mess, and there's a whole lot of collective implication. But the thing is, that's what we have to deal with if we want this to stop or get better. If we don't ever deal with that, it will never get better. It will just repeat over and over and over again.
Thank you for that. I think that's right on. You know, a lot of the work that Religions for Peace USA does in the United States around this issue of Islamophobia through our program, Our Muslim Neighbor, is convene regular people together around a low-key informal dinner, where we ask them to bring a dish, and we'll invite people of all different faiths to come together and to talk about the values of hospitality, to talk about the values of diversity, about what it means to come together as a community. But the point of it is but to join together. And I think that you share your pain and your fear, and you hold that with others. I think that is where a community is robust enough and where it's strong enough to withstand sort of shocks that I think that are bound to happen to our community. But there's a challenge in that, and I think that, you know, the Public Religion Research Institute just put out a report, you know, last week that said that this is 6 out of 10 Americans believe that our civil discourse is broken, that there isn't really any space for us to really join in and together in a way in which we can actually speak to each other. So, Omid, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about how you can facilitate and create a culture that withstands and is robust enough to face a challenge that is this conversation that's fear-mongering, that's littered with stereotypes and reductive veneers, but it really allows and cultivates a sense of really probing deeply into people's identity. I did just want to, before we turn to you, Omid, I wanted to welcome Dr. Ron Kraybill, who's joining us from Manilla. And so thank you, Ron, for joining in. Ron is a independent peace-building consultant who's worked in past the United Nations, but is joining us about 12 hours of a difference here for us on the East Coast. So thank you, Ron, for tuning in. And I'm going to jump to Omid, and then we'll turn directly to you.
Sure, thank you. So let me build on something that Sister Jerusha had mentioned, which is the importance of acknowledging fear. And look, fear is a powerful, motivating, primal human sentiment. We're all afraid of many things, afraid of death, afraid of losing our loved ones, afraid of losing our status. But I think as people of faith and as people committed to an interfaith understanding, we also have to be committed to the notion that we are not limited by fear. One of the great insights of the Islamic tradition, particularly through the voices of people like Rumi, is the notion that in life you can be motivated by fear or you can be motivated by love. And that the path of love actually transcends and transforms that understanding of fear. And so I think one of the ways that one could start a conversation like that would be exactly as you mentioned, Aaron, to get people around the table to break bread together, because there is something transformative that happens when we eat together. As long as it's just intellectual chit-chat, I'm not sure how far we're going to get, but it's very difficult to hate somebody that you're passing a piece of bread to. And if it happens to be falafel and curry and gyros and basmati rice, then all the better. That notion that people would be able to share what their fears and their concerns are. And as I travel around the country and around the world, I noticed that more and more people express their fears and their anxieties in very similar ways. We all want a roof over our children's heads. We want them to grow up in a world where their bodies, their integrity, their dignity, their lives are not up for assault. We want them to have a chance at a decent, dignified living. And then everybody wants their children to marry somebody of their own exact identity. The nice Iranian girl, Indian girl, Jewish girl, Irish girl, African-American girl. So, those are commonalities that we all can build on and God willing, transcend at some point as well. And so I think that's the initial part about it. Part of what I think we also got to keep pushing for is, what do these words mean? What do we mean by love? What do we mean by peace? And where does it end? What's the limit of our love? If my love just ends with me, then that's narcissism. If my love just ends with my family, then that's nepotism. If it just ends with the people who share my color or my ethnicity, then that's racism. If it just ends with the people who pray the same way that I do, then that's religious chauvinism. So we got to always insist that we be grounded and rooted in love, but also to keep insisting that the circle of our love keep expanding, keep widening, keep deepening, until nobody is left outside. And when we speak about peace, do we mean by it simply the absence of fighting, the absence of killing? Which I would take that. I would take that as a starting point in a world in which we see, as we saw in Gaza this summer, fathers having to go through the rubbles with a trash bag to pick up the pieces of what used to be their daughter. Right? No human being should ever have to do that. So that's the minimum starting place. But ultimately what we mean by peace isn't just the absence of fighting, it is where that understanding of justice and love shows up in the public arena. And I think that's something that as people of faith, we have to insist on, that we're not minimalists. We're not simply willing to settle for a world in which we as human beings are not killing each other, but rather we want to be participants in creating a world in which God's love is unleashed onto this world, and we become the channels through which that happens. Let me pause there.
Thank you for that. Thank you. You know, one of the values of this conversation is that we have a wide variety of perspectives here among the panelists. And our conversation here around the challenge of building an interfaith community in the face of what we see as stereotypes and racism and ethnocentrism. If we have to be able to broaden our conversation, but in order to do that, we have to understand the limits of where our conversation is, what they are. And I think the response of Bill Maher and Sam Harris was especially insightful for the limits of our conversation in the United States, because it raised up a couple of key points, and one of those was specifically that we live in a quote-unquote secular society where religion and politics are deeply, supposedly, divided. But this is, it's a definition in my mind that's based on a certain understanding of how religion acts in the public sphere, what it means to be a person of faith in a community, what it means to have convictions that are based in a religious or moral philosophy. But I think that Ron perhaps offers some different perspectives here on working in other parts of the world and how peace building and how that process of peace building occurs when conflicts like this arise. And the question of particularly whether religion is primarily a cause of conflict in the world. So I wanted to turn now to Ron to offer a little bit of that perspective on how religious peace building and interfaith peace building takes place in other aspects of the world, and how it is that we can talk about the conversation based in the United States and its limits in regard to the conversation that's happening in other parts of the world. Ron, would you perhaps reflect with us a little bit on that?
Yes, thank you. Am I coming through okay?
Perfectly. Thank you.
First of all, apologies for arriving late. I've actually been here the whole time. I had technical difficulties, and I could hear you, but I wasn't in the conversation. So I did not get everything because I was struggling to figure out what was happening, but I have heard a number of the pieces of what's been said so far. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this conversation. I might begin by saying that I've lived and worked in Africa and Asia for a number of years now, and in the contexts in which I work, it is taken for granted that religious faith is a part of being human, and there's not this kind of sense of embarrassment or quickness to blame religion in general. It's more just kind of taken for granted that this is who we are, and so I find the conversation that one picks up in over here is in the U.S. and Western Europe about I don't know, the tendency to just blame religion for things and to try to remove, get us to be secular. I find it very much out of touch with where most of the world lives as I experience it. So I just to say that for starters. I spent quite a few years working for religiously based organizations in a peace-building capacity, and now for the last several years I've been working for the UN. I, in Africa, spent several years in Lesotho. That tiny country inside of South Africa, working with heads of churches there who were mediating in a very difficult electoral conflict that brought the country to a standstill for several years. And this is a country that has repeatedly had problems with electoral violence and major damage on several occasions. And in that context, religious leaders there and many places in Africa, really, religious leaders are the only game in town. If government, if things break down at a political level, there's just no one else who comes anywhere close to having the institutional capacities and the leadership capacities that religious institutions have. Now I'm in the Philippines, and it's a different context here, but here also religious leaders are a prominent part of the environment and looked to and taken very seriously for response to difficult situations. I'm going to stop there. I want to come back at some point maybe and say something about fear, because I think, in my understanding, that's a critical thing to understand, and I think the American people, unfortunately, do not realize the way in which they are being manipulated by fear, and I think there's a little I'd like to say about that. But first, let me toss it back to you.
Right, Omid or Jerusha, do either you want to? I mean, I am interested to hear what Ron has to say about fear, but I want to open up to any responses to you, to what Ron has just specifically said. Well, then, Ron, please go ahead and jump right into what you're going to say.
I get a license to speak. I think that one can speak about fear at several levels, and as people of faith, in the end, our faith should speak the most loudly on this. But I also like to present myself the challenge, whenever possible, to speak at a very pragmatic level. And I'm going to do that because we've already heard some very insightful things as from people of faith, particularly Omid, you spoke on this. The thing that I think is important to understand here is that fear is the weapon of ISIS. It is their chosen tactic, and it is not for nothing that they are putting horrifying videos in front of the world, doing things that all decent human beings find horrible. And what ISIS, okay, I spent over the years, I've had the opportunity to interact with a number of people who were in liberation movements of one sort or another. And my first was an old Vietnamese professor and who knew the Viet Cong very well. And then I've spent a fair bit of time in Asia and interacted with people there, various kinds of people who would be considered terrorists by one government or another. And what I have always, something that comes through very, very clearly, actually, let me put this in the form of a story. I was interacting with a guy who came from one of the, who was close to, let's put it that way, to one of the movements in India that's considered, that uses terrorism. And he said to me at one point, you know, we spent hours debating which police station to attack, and what we were always interested in was how could we, which police station, if we attacked it, would bring the biggest reaction from the Indian Army. And what they wanted to do was to provoke a strong reaction, military reaction. And why? Because they knew that when there's a strong military reaction, civilians suffer, and that this will drive, their idea was that it drives the civilians into the arms of their group. This is an old idea, it's been around for a long time, and it seems to me pretty clear that this is a major strategy of ISIS, that their fondest hope is that they could trigger major, heavy military response, kinetic response, as the coalition people call it, against them, because many, many people will suffer. Civilians will suffer, and then that will strengthen the base of ISIS. It's the only hope for them to succeed with what they want to do, is to build their numbers. So they have to provoke attack. Fear is their primary strategy to do that. If they can get the Western allies to be very afraid and to overreact from that fear with heavy kinetic response, they have a chance, a worryingly good chance of succeeding. So to me, we don't even have to be people of faith. We just need to be intelligent and understanding what we're up against. And if we are self-interested, all we need to do even is to be self-interested in order not to overreact to this bait that's being placed in front of us.
Thank you for that, Omid.
Yeah, let me make 3 quick points to extend the conversation, and let me start by looking at the issue of ISIS and the imagery that they're using. So let's ask the question: why is it that they are putting these Western journalists and AIDS workers in orange jumpsuits? Right. So what ISIS is doing is providing a grotesque mirror for some of the policies of the United States. Who else is in orange jumpsuits? The prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, the ones that we don't seem to want to talk about, the ones that have been held indefinitely, sometimes for over a decade, without access to any kind of a legal due process. We're talking about those 164 people, about 120 of whom are on a hunger strike because they would rather be dead than to be held indefinitely. And as we go around condemning ISIS, and we should, we also have a moral responsibility to ask about those other victims in orange jumpsuits, the ones that no one seems to talk about. We also have a responsibility as we deplore the grotesque violence of ISIS, which, by the way, is staged to look like American horror movies, right? These are people who are replicating the pornographic aesthetic of American violence. We also have a responsibility to ask the question, if beheadings are so morally repugnant, and they are, why is it that it is the beheadings of ISIS that we have now assembled an international coalition about, but no one seems to want to talk about the beheadings of Saudi Arabia, where in every one of the last few years they've beheaded not 2, not 3, but 79 people. If beheadings are grotesque, why are they any more or less grotesque when it's a terrorist organization than when it is a nation state? And then the last thing that I would just say about the conversation around fear, and let us again never blink away from the fact that ISIS is a repugnant organization in violation of decency and human rights, not to mention the entire corpus of the Islamic tradition. But let us also remember that the framing of ISIS, in a way, has a lot in common with the framing of the Ebola discussion, where the purpose of corporate media in America is that it's a cash-producing enterprise. It's not designed to inform you. It's designed to tantalize you. It's designed to keep you hooked. Because the more you stay hooked, the more you watch the commercials, the more they get to generate revenue. So because of that, there's a way in which the discussion is not particularly designed to inform, to educate, to uplift, to transform. It's literally a terrorizing, terror-inducing, fear-amplifying enterprise. And if we are in the business of saying that an informed democratic experiment needs to be an educated enterprise, then we have to insist on a different kind of conversation, a conversation in which there is such a thing as context, as history, as politics, as economics, and we insist on asking those kinds of difficult questions. Why is it that the Middle East seems to be in such a morally depraved kind of a state? What is the role and the role of indigenous movements, and what role has the United States played in the region over the course of the last few decades? And to insist on that kind of a broader, more informed conversation is not passing the buck, it's simply insisting on an educated, uplifting conversation.
Absolutely, and that's part of why I wanted to bring all of you three here together. But I want to turn to Dr. Lamptey, because I feel like, Dr. Lamptey, you're in a very unique situation, being at a Christian seminary, but being an associate professor of Islam and ministry. And I wanted to talk a little bit about exactly what Omid was hinting on there, is that ingrained within the American social fabric is this idea of a democratic experiment that depends on civic educated discourse. So how do you engage your students around these conversations? What do you stress to them? Are there things that you've been surprised about? Bring it down again to the level that you've done so well so far, of saying, you know, what are the challenges and how do we practically, in very simple manners, face them? Please.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the practical manners, but I also want to make one comment about what has been mentioned just previously, and that's this discussion of the public discourse. And I always say that I think we have to be very, very careful about becoming unwitting dance partners in this oversimplified tango, if you will, which is where we think that we are saying what is right, but in fact we are really responding to an oversimplified rhetoric and a dance and a drama that has been laid out. And not only is that not productive, but it is also not even in our best self-interest. Now, I don't like to barter in self-interest as the #1 level of what we should be doing, but even at that level, we are being sucked into both actions and a way of speaking that is not self-interested, nor productive, nor leading down a road that will help us to extricate ourselves as human beings from some of these quagmires. So I just want to say that first. The second is that I don't have the answer of how we do that, and I think that that is what we need to talk about, because I agree with Omid that we need to be having this kind of conversation that acknowledges the symbolism in play, and that acknowledges that it's not just a good and bad, good versus evil dialectic, but it is a complex aggressions and oppressions across the board and woven together into intricate fashions. But how do we get people there? Especially if they're raised and reared on oversimplified fear-mongering. How do you get people in there without them shutting down? So I don't have the answer to that, but I'm going to answer your question. Maybe we could discuss that a little bit. So I find myself, both in a public context and in an academic context, in a situation where these things frequently have to be walked through. And walk through in a manner where the intellectual content and background information is not always present. So I don't always have the luxury of talking about Islam with people who know all about the tradition already and are in their 5th course or have grown up in it. They're coming to it largely because they're interested, and let's be frank, largely because of what they hear on the news, and they have an inkling that there's something more they should know. So that's a great burden, and I guess I would just like to acknowledge that, because maybe that's not something that other people understand, but for people who do public discourse on Islam and teaching on Islam, we don't get the privilege of doing that in an intellectually disinterested context. We never get to talk about Islam or teach on it with just people who are interested to learn. Now, most people aren't interested to learn just to learn, but with Islam, it's particularly sensitive. There's a whole host of things that you have to predict, preempt, think about before you can even get to the content. So you're simultaneously trying to teach people what the Quran is while talking about violence on the news, and you never have a way to get out of that. And so I guess one of the things that I would say that I have found helpful is that people need the chance to grapple with some of the content themselves. So one of the ways I do that is when I teach on the Quran and violence, I just let my students loose to read the Quran. Have at it. Because I have a feeling and a suspicion that they're going to be surprised at what they find in light of what they've heard they will find. Now, will they find all wonderful and glowing things? Will they find nothing that can't be manipulated? Absolutely not. But the overwhelming evidence is that, ooh, yeah, this is not what I thought I would find. And so I guess I would just throw that out as one piece, is that people need an environment in which they can engage the material without the layers of interpretation done for them. But how do we create that environment? Because not everyone's going to be a student in my classroom or in other people's classroom. How do we create that opportunity? And I don't think it's going to happen through the public media. So maybe there's an opportunity for us as interfaith, and I'm not even just interfaith, just other alternative, morally concerned, humanistic voices, to create a parallel discourse, and one that refuses to be the dance partner of the reductive discourse, one that refuses to say, you say Islam is bad, I say it's good. We don't have to just be the rebounding wall. One that says, you know what, say what you want. I'm going to say something totally different, and I will condemn barbarism. I will condemn atrocities wherever I find them, but I'm going to create a whole nother infrastructure of discourse. That's where I think we need to be talking, because this bouncing the ball off the wall stuff, it doesn't work. It's ineffective. We need to condemn, but our condemnations aren't heard. And they're not heard because they're premised upon a faulty assumption, which is a dualistic binary discourse. So we need something new. And I don't know what that is, so maybe we can brainstorm that.
Thank you. I think that's right on, and I'm eager, and I want to just jump right into that right now. I think one of the things that Religions for Peace brings to the table is a deep commitment to building understanding and building community, and working to bridge divides that have been creative and are lucrative, to a culture that is materialistic, that is driven by interests. But you know what Religions for Peace USA does in the United States through its Our Muslim Neighbor initiative is to bring people from all contexts together to have public, educated, civil discourse, but then also to exchange and to enter into experiences together. We need sustained dialogues. We need longer exposure, longer time to wrestle with things in order to allow things to sit with us, that then they'll finally rub in a way that opens things new. Our culture now doesn't facilitate that. We are driven on timelines. We're driven on you know, urgency, and we don't have or create the space in which we can actually, one, be vulnerable with each other in order then to share the anxieties that we have, that we can then build power and activism and strength to counter the forces that we find in our society. I think if you look in a lot of the work for Religions for Peace and with Our Muslim Neighbor, we're based down in Nashville in Middle Tennessee, one of the most interesting places to be in the United States, primarily just because of the confluence of cultures that's occurring in that area right now. It's got the second largest Kurdish population there, one of the largest Somali populations there. And so you've got high immigrants, you know, there, and then you also have high levels of Christian organizations there who voice and who are active in the community. And you know, getting those people together, bringing them under situations where they can, one, understand that both of them, you know, if you have a Christian pastor and a local imam who both say that they have kids in the schools and they're concerned about, you know, the experiences of their kids, those are the things that really bond people together. And that is in no way ever an attempt to gloss over the differences that allow us to understand how it is work, because it really depends on unsung heroes bringing people together who aren't big media stories. These aren't the things you hear because it's not lucrative, but it's going on, and it gives us hope. And so this is part of what you have to do to build understanding, to understand where somebody is coming from, to understand that your truth and somebody else's truth can coexist, and what that means then, to be together. Ron or Omid, I want to bring it up for either of you to respond there. And for any of the audience members, please feel free to email or tweet in your questions. We've gone over already, so I want to make sure that we are respectful to our panelists' times. But we'll enter now after Ron or Omid offer some reflection to welcome in any questions from the audience. And I want to make sure that we do include those. We've got a couple already, but we'll make sure to pick out one or two for sure. So Ron or Omid, please jump in here.
I would like to respond to something that Dr. Lamptey said. I'm in the Philippines, and I'm sort of out of the loop of what's being said in North America these days. But what I read in the media gives me a very strong feeling that Muslims in the U.S. are exhausted right now, particularly those who feel a personal responsibility to speak as some kind of voice for their communities. And I'm thinking of a blog I read by, this was actually a German Muslim woman who commented about her despair that it makes any difference, because she said, I'm asked all the time, or so why aren't Muslims objecting to this and speaking out? And she said, we are. It's been there for years. And when I read this, my thought was, wow, this is really something that those of us who are majority Christian culture and are concerned about this need to really hear this. There are limits to what people of good intention and goodwill can do. All of us struggle to hold our lives together. And my thought was that I would wish to see some wellspring of deep compassion rise up from people in the larger community where there are Muslims living as a minority. Put yourself in their shoes and think about how it would feel, and realize how lonely and scary and exhausting and worrying it all would all be. I don't know what kind of outreach would feel good from those Muslims, but I would expect, to those Muslims, I don't know how they want to be supported, but I'm sure that, taking a casserole over, any small gesture just of human solidarity, I have a guess would have extremely powerful impact in this particular moment. In my view, it is the Muslim community in the end, more than anyone else, is positioned to challenge the extremists, and even we don't know. As I think many of us recognize, there's a kind of a psychosis here, and psychotic people don't tend to respond terribly well to anyone, even their brothers and sisters. So we must not have too high an expectation. And yet, if anyone has a chance of getting through, it may be the Muslim community, and so we need to support them. Having said that, I have to say we must step forward to work on our own stuff, because there is a lot of stuff that we need to work on about history, about failure to listen, about failure to understand, about failure to see the seeds of destruction that have been planted quietly and unobserved from our side for decades. And we need to start working on that even as we support those Muslims who might have a chance of reaching out to fellow Muslims.
Yeah, and let me add also just a couple of quick words. So I think one of the casualties of this fear-driven culture in which we live in right now is the cultivation of a defensive moment in our public discourse. And I, for one, have very little interest in defensive conversations, as Sister Jerusha said so beautifully, as long as we're only answering stupid questions with flawed frameworks, we're only going to get flawed answers. And so how do we create conversations in which we ask different questions and pray for and work for and struggle for different outcomes that are going to be implemented? What I also want to really emphasize is that it's understandable why any of us, whether we're coming from the Muslim community, poor and working class folk, women's rights movements, immigrant movements, gay and lesbian communities, why any of us would be, and of course all the double and triple overlaps between and among those identities and communities, why we would be concerned about the assault on our own communities at a particular time. What really gives me hope, and what I hope that we hold ourselves accountable for, is the connecting of our suffering. And that's something that I do see happening. I see it happening in important ways when I see Muslims showing up in the Mike Brown and Ferguson conversation in ways that I've never seen before, where people begin to understand that the mechanism of racism and brutality and violence that is underwriting the conversation in Ferguson is part and parcel of the same military-industrial complex that is shaping the realities of life in the Middle East, and we make that explicit. So I get that, and I also get what Brother Ron is talking about, the tiredness and the fatigue and exhaustion, but I also want us to never, not for one breath, allow ourselves to wallow in misery and wallow in pity. Pity and love don't drink from the same fountain. And I think if any of us think that our life is tough, you know, we got to try being a single mom working 2 shifts just to make ends meet, which is, of course, a reality for many, many people in our own communities and in our neighbor communities. So are people tired and exhausted? Yes. Are we tired of having our babies having to go to schools and answer questions that no child should ever have to answer? Yes. Are we tired of a world in which your simple fact, I mean, that's where I always say diversity is not an ideology, it's a reality. It's a reality. It's how do we acknowledge the fact that the world is simply made up of different folks with different colors, different races, different cultures, different languages, different ways of expressing their love for one another. So how do we somehow reflect that diversity to people and allow the truth of our existence, including our suffering, to speak to other people without necessarily falling into the trap of allowing some people's flawed, perhaps racist, and deeply problematic ways of framing those lives become the categories through which we spend our lives explaining ourselves. And my life, our lives are too short to be spent explaining ourselves through other people's categories.
If I could add one thing to just what Omid said, I think that he brought up the example of Muslims for Ferguson, and I think that this is also a very productive place for us to think and consider. And it's certainly not new, because the concern of Muslims for things that we would call non-Muslim issues is not a new thing. but I think that it's a very fertile place to operate because it does destabilize the oversimplified narrative of Muslims just being Muslim-y, or just every single thing they do is about Islam and Muslimness. And that is the byproduct of the us versus them narrative. And but I think that what's so fertile about these kind of endeavors, and there's a lot of them with green Muslims and green Deen and about climate change and about LGBT rights and things like this coming up, recognizing some of people's sensitivities, but understanding this is an intersectionality that's important as an issue. And I just think that what's so fertile about it is that it destabilizes the trope and the narrative that we are spoon-fed. But it also gives us a way to be productive and not just be hammered down by the fact that our responding to reactionary discourse seems ineffective. We can be involved, and we, through our involvement, can model that the narrative of oppression and identity manipulation and oversimplified discourse is not just a singular narrative, and it's not just about Muslims. It occurs over and over and over again. And so I think that that is a fertile place for people to be involved.
Absolutely, thank you. We have a question that just came in that's directed directly to Ron, and so I wanted to pose this to him. And the question that came from the audience is, how would you apply peacemaking principles in the context of armed groups such as ISIS? And one of the things that's particularly important to me about this question is that its ability to hone in on how ethnic identity is part of the conversation that we have somehow glossed over in understanding where ISIS came from. This returns us back to Omid's points at the beginning of paying attention to history. So there's really two halves of this question of really looking at the applying peacemaking principles, just peacemaking principles, in the context of ISIS, but also understanding the context of ISIS, of where that is.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's one that I ask myself probably several times per day, because what is a better way? I think it's important to say from the beginning, I don't have simple answers here. I think the answers will take time, just as military campaigns take time. Peacemaking campaigns and figuring out what's going to work takes time. Having said that, there are some principles that guide me. The first principle that I think we ought to keep in mind is that this battle, if we want to call it a battle, will be won not according to whether or not we're able to squash X number of militants in a battlefield somewhere. Rather, this battle will be won or lost on the basis of what happens in the communities from which those militants come. We have to think of those communities as our target here, and everything that we do, we have to run through the grid of how will this play out in those communities. I'm convinced that that's one of their major goals from the militant side. That's actually the audience, one of the key audiences that they're playing for, and it's the one that should guide us. So, and I think what happens militarily with these, it's in the end, it's a couple handfuls of thousands of militants who have gathered in one place. What happens there is small change compared to the dynamics that need to unfold between us and the larger communities. So how would we reach those communities? That's where it's complex. It's obviously, we're not talking about days, weeks, months. We're talking about years. And we know there are so many spheres of human interaction through which we can engage human beings in the modern world. It's business, education, science, media, music. There are all these enterprises through which human beings, each of these could be a modality of engagement and understanding. And of course, as soon as we start to do that, we would realize how much we actually don't know. We don't know anything about how rural people in Yemen understand what is happening in their country and how they understand the role of the U.S. in that situation. So we would have a lot to learn and understand in order to be able to come at this. But I think that is, we have to begin to think at that level of complexity if we're really going to avoid, the big danger here in my view is that we do kinetics and we just really multiply the number of people who consider, you know, the coalition in the West as enemies and as terribly destructive, and we actually feed this fire by pouring gasoline on it. And that's my biggest worry, and I'm afraid that right now decisions are being made and strategies are being unwound, or, you know, developed and delivered that could very possibly do that. Exactly what do we do with the bad guys? I don't have simplistic answers to that. But as you can see, I think it's not really the most important question.
So let me also add, you know, one other voice on that discussion, which is coming back to that basic question of, as people of faith, what do we have to say? What do we have to say in a world in which we the people have now allowed government structures and industry structures to take hold, in which our collective resources are being utilized to create these ongoing war machines. It's not that the governments are spending their money, they're spending our money. This is my tax dollars and your tax dollars. And what I want to ask, in this world in which we're being perpetually demanded to speak on ISIS, is I want to connect the conversation about ISIS to the conversation about the military-industrial complex. I want to know, where are our imams, where are our rabbis, where are our ministers on the question of the military-industrial complex? Where is the voice of the king tradition saying to us eloquently, passionately, in tears, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death? Why is it that the President of the United States can stand in the United Nations and ask us to condemn ISIS, but then if that same voice, if that same community, if that same religious prophetic tradition speaks out against American drones, we're somehow seen as being disruptive, dangerous, and unpatriotic? What do we do about a world in which we, as the United States, is both arming Israel to the teeth and then dropping a few pittance on Palestinians to pick up their pieces after the war is over? Do we have something to offer the world other than this death machine and then a few band-aids on the side? And I think these questions are actually linked together. The kids who are going over to fight in ISIS, the 3,000 or so militants from around the world, yes, some of them might be would-be terrorists, yes, some of them might be unstable kids. A lot of them, if you speak with them and if you listen to their diaries and their online postings, they're also kids who are in anguish. They say, how often have I seen human beings suffering in Syria and not seeing anybody do anything about it, and I want to do something about it. Now, that sentiment is a noble sentiment. The channel through which they're pursuing it is vastly misguided. How do we create conversations, opportunities, channels, institutions, organizations for those well-intentioned kids who want to be part of the healing of humanity to have a means to become participants rather than just signing up and go fighting in a would-be jihad? And I think those are really difficult questions that we have to ask ourselves in light of this over-militarized world that we've allowed to become a reality.
Absolutely. Thank you for offering that perspective, Omid. I think that's right on, and I think that's part of what we continue to return to in this conversation of, as Dr. Lamptey has said, of shifting away from this us versus them, of understanding where people are in this. In this vast sort of terrain of the conversation regarding ISIS, and I think it begins with relationships and begins with infrastructures and communities that hold and bring people together, which is and then allows us to really understand and validate all people's experiences and all sides of all people's experiences. I think those are key. The last questions that I want to ask came in, and it is it's one of the things that we've been returning to is how do religious leaders shift the conversation? This comes from a partner of Religions for Peace USA, the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, asking, as a coalition of religious leaders standing with American Muslims against bigotry, what more should be done to shift the conversation? So, Dr. Lamptey, I want to pose this directly to you and ask you to possibly, because I feel like it aligns with a little bit more of what you were talking about in reframing of us versus them. How do you, and perhaps what is your experience of standing with other religious leaders to reframe this conversation and to perhaps connect all the issues and the anxieties of citizens and regular people in the United States, not just a Muslim and a non-Muslim conversation,
Well, yeah, it does return to what I've been, I don't want to say dancing around because now I've negatively characterized dancing. It's a very complex dance. But what I've been talking about, I do think that there are a few things. I do appreciate the sentiment that there is a need for solidarity, and I also appreciate Omid's sentiment that it's not about pitying. I don't think there's any time for pitying or wallowing, but I do think that especially American Muslims, we are not suffering like other people suffer by and large, but we are in the pressure cooker, and that can be very exhausting. And always dancing between people who are pushing you up against the wall is an exhausting thing. And so I do think that one step is expressions of solidarity, and whether that's expressions through various casseroles of different types, or whether it is through taking a public voice and saying, look, we as people of faith and as people of humanistic consciousness, of people of different backgrounds, moral concern, will not tolerate this discussion or this vilification or this request for something that no one else has been asked for. I think that that's an important step. I don't think it's the final step, though. I think that religious leaders, and I don't even want to exclude people who are not religious. I think people who have a moral concern in general, that they need to come together, and they need to make places and spaces for this conversation to take place. They need to be very conscientious and careful about the manner in which they employ identity in these discussions, though, because sometimes we are not so careful. Look, there also needs to be, there's this great trope, and we just had a conference on it talking about this idea, Islam's not a religion because it doesn't adhere to the idea of the secular versus religious divide, as if other religions really do that very well in the United States, and we all know they don't. But I think that there needs to be discussion of that. No religious or even worldview perspective is politically inert. they are concerned. They're concerned with issues. And I think we need to come out and say, look, we are concerned with the presentation. We are concerned with the moral crisis. And also then to formulate various messages of hope, because it's not enough to just roll out all of the dirty laundry. That can be incapacitating. So there needs to be a both and. So there needs to be solidarity with Muslims. There needs to be a forum and spaces that says, I'm not going to respond to the ping pong rhetoric. I'm going to say it's a moral crisis that's bigger and things are interconnected. And if you're scared of the complexity, I understand why you're scared, but that is the reality. So you can be scared and go to simple discourse, but you're going to be scared tomorrow and the next day and the day after. Or you can get in the thick of it and we can start to do something productive. So solidarity, complex discussions, but then we also need to offer some hope. We need small, what I like to say, every day ihsan, like little actions of beauty every day, little things that matter every day. And we need to do that as a group. We don't need to do that as Americans. We don't need to do that as Muslims. We don't need to do that as Christians. We don't need to do that as atheists. We need to do it together, because that's the only way that we'll learn, first of all, who we are, but also how to do things together. Sounds very simple, but if we're not working together, we're not going to work it out together.
Absolutely. I think, Jerusha, I think this last point of finding simple little moments of hope in our everyday lives is so pivotal, of providing and offering a message that's contrary to simple just reactionary, but rather a productive understanding of what it means to be a person of faith or a person of moral and philosophical orientation in order to guide yourself in the world that brings you into relation for others, because we all exist in a social world. We depend on each other. And in our values, if we can galvanize and build structures upon those values to provide for common actions that really have a deep and critical understanding of peace, that isn't simply just a lack of violence, but is qualified and characterized by deeper understanding and deeper relationality and deeper community with each other. That's when we will really begin, I think, to make a lot of headway. But absolutely, muddling through this is where we are. This is where we are. So thank you all of you, Ron, Omid, and Jerusha for being here. I think this was a wonderful and fruitful discussion. Thank you for all of you who have tuned in across the United States and across the world. We will continue to provide you with some of the best experts and interfaith activists and peace builders around the world, providing conversations around these key issues, which is offered in all of their complexity and all of their messiness. But we are sure as heck continuing through them and going through them together. So I want to thank again Ron. Thank you for joining us from Manila. Omid, thank you for coming to us from Duke, and Dr. Lamptey, thank you for coming to us from New York City. We'll be back again next month with another conversation, and we will inform you all about that and we'll get that set up. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.